Her name was Elizabeth. She was only 23 years old, and she had worked near a German supply camp, mainly doing laundry and clerical tasks for soldiers. She was not a combatant, and she had never imagined that she would become a prisoner of war. Near the end of 1944, when Allied forces swept through the region faster than anyone expected, she and several other women were gathered by soldiers and questioned. They were told that because they had worked for the German military, the idea felt unreal to Elizabeth because she had grown up in a small town and had expected to return home after the war ended. Instead, she was placed on a truck headed toward the coast. She carried only a small bag with basics, a hairbrush, a comb, and one extra shirt. She did not know where she was being taken, only that the journey would be long. But before we continue, I want to clarify that this is a story I discovered in the World War II archives, and if you want to hear more untold stories from history, make sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button, and tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. It's really fascinating to see how far these forgotten stories can reach. All right. When the truck reached the harbor, Elizabeth saw the ship waiting. It was large and crowded with uniformed guards and prisoners, men and women, all being loaded into different sections. Seeing the ocean unsettled her. It felt like a border between her old life and a future she could not picture. Days at sea passed slowly. Meals were simple, but she noticed the guards were not hostile toward them. They gave instructions without shouting. Sometimes, when language got in the way, a guard tried to explain something by pointing or using hand gestures. Elizabeth realized that these men did not act like the enemies she had been told to fear. They were simply doing their duty, just as she once had. Rumors spread that the ship was not headed to England or France. It was going all the way to America. Elizabeth listened but refused to believe it at first. America felt too far away to be real. Some women whispered that America had plenty of food, that there was no hunger. Elizabeth wanted to hope, but fear kept her from embracing the idea. When the ship finally slowed down, a voice called out that land was ahead. Every prisoner, including Elizabeth, moved toward the railings. Some climbed onto crates just to see over others. Elizabeth squeezed between two women and looked out. She had expected a coast that looked similar to what she knew from Europe, possibly damaged, crowded with soldiers, tense and chaotic because of the war. Instead, she saw a port that looked organized and busy, and nothing about it suggested a nation living under bombing or fear. Elizabeth could see large cranes moving cargo from ships. Workers operated machines with a steady pace, not in panic or exhaustion. Trucks lined up to collect materials. People on the docks worked without looking over their shoulders or reacting to distant explosions. Everyone looked focused on tasks, and nobody seemed worried about safety. It was a normal workday to them, even though a ship carrying prisoners of war had just arrived. She tried to take everything in at once. Cloth banners labeled different warehouses. Guard posts were present, but the guards near the docks behaved casually. They leaned on railings, talked among themselves, and occasionally pointed toward the ship to direct workers on where to position the gangway. They were not tense. They were not shouting. They were not rushing. Elizabeth realized what she was seeing. This place had routine. Routine meant the war did not reach their daily lives. The idea felt difficult for her to process. She had spent years waking up to air raid sirens, rushing to shelters, and walking past damaged buildings on her way to work. She expected any military area to resemble the crowded and anxious atmosphere she had known in Germany. Everything looked controlled, predictable, and stable. A guard spoke to the group of women through a translator. They would disembark soon and they would be taken through processing. The tone was informational rather than commanding. Elizabeth listened closely. She did not want to miss any instructions. She felt her stomach tighten when she heard that they were officially in the United States. Even though she had suspected it during the voyage, hearing it confirmed made the situation more real. She was farther from home than she had ever imagined she could be. As the ship docked, she noticed the cleanliness of the work areas. There was no trash piled in corners, no broken equipment, no signs of neglect. Everything had a place. Workers cleaned equipment after use. People wore uniforms that looked new, not patched or repaired. In Germany, especially near the end of the war, equipment was used until it fell apart. Here, nothing appeared worn out or near failure. Elizabeth observed the vehicles on the dock. They were large and moved without stalling. She had heard months earlier that America had an endless supply of fuel, but seeing vehicles moving without hesitation made her understand the difference. It was not just abundance of fuel, it was stability. Stability shaped how people behaved, how they worked, and even how they moved. The moment she stepped onto the gangway, she felt the solid surface under her boots. She felt watched, but not threatened. Guards stood nearby, but they kept a professional distance. They did not push or rush the prisoners. They just directed them where to walk. Elizabeth followed the path with the others. For the first time in a long while, she was in a place not dominated by war damage. It made her feel small, uncertain, and strangely relieved at the same time. She could not stop thinking one thing. They have no idea what the war feels like the way we do. When Elizabeth and the other women reached the camp, the guards directed them into a long building. Everything happened in a steady order. There was no shouting or confusion. The women were separated into lines, and each line moved toward a table where American personnel waited with papers, typewriters, and folders. Elizabeth looked around carefully. She wanted to understand what would happen next. She noticed that the camp staff behaved as if they had done this process many times before. They did not rush, and they did not seem angry or stressed. Their behavior gave her a small sense of safety, even though she was still afraid of what the future might hold. When it was her turn, an officer asked for her name. He spoke slowly, knowing that not all prisoners understood English. A German-speaking interpreter repeated the question for her. Elizabeth said her name, and the officer typed it into a form. The typewriter keys clicked rapidly. Each strike sounded final, like a stamp sealing her identity inside a system she could not control. She was asked her age, birthplace, and previous occupation. The interpreter repeated each question. Elizabeth answered honestly because she did not see any benefit in lying. She could tell that they were collecting information, not trying to intimidate her. After the interview, she was directed to another table where she was issued a small identification tag. It had a number printed on it. The officer explained that the number was now linked to her file and that she would use it when receiving supplies, meals, or work assignments. Elizabeth did not like the idea of being a number, but she understood that the process was not personal. It was simply their system. Next, she was given a camp uniform. Durable trousers, a shirt, and a jacket. The fabric was rough but clean. She was also given bedding that consisted of blankets and a pillow. The guard handed everything to her without comment. Elizabeth was surprised by the cleanliness of the items. She remembered the shortages back home, where every scrap of cloth was reused, patched, or cut apart. Here everything seemed available and maintained. The guards led the women to a room where they could wash and change into the uniforms. For the first time in days, Elizabeth used running water. She washed her face and hands slowly because she did not know when she might have access to clean water again. The uniform fit loosely, but it was comfortable enough. When she folded her old clothing, she felt a sharp sense of separation from her past. The uniform meant she was no longer just Elizabeth. She was a prisoner in a foreign country. After changing, the women were led to the dining hall. There, Elizabeth received her first camp meal. She watched as staff placed food on trays in an organized and consistent manner. No one grabbed or pushed. No one yelled. When her turn came, she received soft white bread, a pat of butter, jam, warm vegetables, and potatoes. When she sat down and took the first bite, she had to pause. She had not tasted bread like that in years. In Germany, food had become dry, rationed, flavorless, stretched as far as possible to feed many people with little supplies. Here, everything tasted fresh. It startled her that something as ordinary as bread could affect her so strongly. She looked around the room. The other women were having similar reactions. Some ate slowly, afraid of appearing greedy. Others wiped away tears quietly because the taste of real food reminded them of life before the war. A guard stood near the entrance watching, but he kept a respectful distance. It was clear his job was to supervise, not to interfere. After the meal, the prisoners were led outside to their assigned barracks. The building was plain and functional. Inside were rows of bunk beds, a small heating unit, and space for personal items. Each woman chose a bed. Elizabeth placed her bedding on the mattress and smoothed it out. She sat down and exhaled for what felt like the first time that entire day. The room was quiet, no alarms, no distant explosions, just the sound of women settling into unfamiliar yet safe surroundings. That night, she lay awake, listening to the steady breathing of the other prisoners. She did not feel free, but she felt something else, something she had not felt during the final months in Germany. She felt that tomorrow would follow a schedule. She would eat, she would work, she would sleep. The war could not interrupt these things here. The structure of the camp gave her something she had lost, predictability. In the days that followed, Elizabeth began to understand the daily structure of the camp. Everything ran according to a fixed schedule, which was posted on a board outside the barracks. Wake-up time, breakfast, work assignments, breaks, evening hours, it was all laid out clearly. The guards did not allow anyone to ignore the rules, but they did not treat the women harshly either. Orders were delivered in short statements. Gestures helped bridge gaps in language. The structure allowed the prisoners to know what to expect each day, and that stability slowly eased the constant tension inside Elizabeth's stomach. Work assignments varied from person to person. Some women sorted laundry, washed dishes, or cooked in the kitchen under supervision. Others were taken outside the camp to help with agricultural work, such as picking vegetables or sorting crops on nearby farms. The guards walked alongside them during transport, but they did not shout. Elizabeth had been assigned to the sewing room because she knew how to mend clothing. The room was set up with tables, sewing machines, and baskets of fabric. Elizabeth and a small group of women repaired uniforms and clothing for camp personnel. It was repetitive work, but she found comfort in the familiarity of the task. Threading needles and following seams gave her something she could control. During her first week of work, Elizabeth noticed something that surprised her. Sometimes a guard would hold up a torn sleeve or jacket and ask her, through the interpreter, if she thought it was repairable. The guard was not testing her. He genuinely relied on her judgment. For the first time since the capture, she felt that her skills mattered. She was still a prisoner, of course, but her abilities gave her a sense of purpose and routine. Meals were served 3 times a day in the dining hall. They were simple but consistent. Potatoes, vegetables, bread, occasionally meat. The portions were reasonable, not small or watered down. She could finish her meals without feeling watched or rushed. After years of rationing and shortages back home, the dependability of food alone felt like something remarkable. No scrambling, no fear that the supply would run out. In the evenings after work and dinner, the women were free to spend a few hours inside the barracks or outside in a small recreational yard within the fence. Some played cards, others read or wrote letters. Elizabeth often sat on her bunk and cleaned her uniform or organized her bedding. It allowed her to feel grounded in a foreign place where everything was unfamiliar. Over time, she noticed small details that showed how different life here was compared to wartime Germany. Tools were not locked away. Supplies were not rationed. If something broke in the sewing room, a replacement was provided. If the guards told prisoners to line up, they did so without panic. No one ran for shelter because there were no explosions or sirens. The camp had rules, but it also had predictability. Predictability slowly replaced fear. The women formed small friendships within the camp, mostly based on work groups or shared barracks. Conversations were quiet and cautious at first, focused on daily tasks or memories from home. They avoided talking about the future because the future was uncertain. Elizabeth did not know when she would return to Germany. She did not know what would be left when she did, but she knew she would sleep in the same bed each night, eat at the same time each day, and work in a warm room with steady lighting and functioning tools. As weeks passed, Elizabeth began to notice something that surprised her again and again. The food in the camp was not only regular, it was varied. In Germany, especially near the end of the war, meals had become predictable and scarce. Bread was dark and stretched with fillers. Butter was replaced with substitutes. Vegetables were stored for too long or boiled until flavor disappeared. Here in the United States, even basic meals tasted different. Once a week, the camp kitchen received ingredients that Elizabeth had not seen in years. Sometimes it was peanut butter, something she remembered only from stories about America. It came in large containers and had a thick texture. It stuck to the roof of her mouth at first, and she did not know what to think of it, but eventually she learned to spread it on bread and eat it slowly. The taste was unfamiliar but rich, and she realized it was full of calories. In Germany, anything that could give energy had become valuable. Here it was just another option on the table. Another time, she received cornbread with her meal. The texture was dense and slightly crumbly, and the flavor was mildly sweet. She had never eaten anything made from cornmeal before. In Germany, corn was mostly animal feed, not something used to make bread. She studied the piece on her tray at first, confused about whether it was dessert or bread. When she bit into it, she was surprised by the balance of sweet and savory flavor. The women at her table exchanged comments, trying to decide if they liked it. Elizabeth did. It felt warm and filling. There were days when the kitchen served stew with beans, carrots, and pieces of meat. The broth was thick, and the dish could keep a person full for hours. Elizabeth noticed that many American meals focused on protein and energy, not just taste. It was practical food, made to support long work days. She respected that. It was different from German meals, which often focused on sauces, potatoes, and familiar spices. American food seemed simpler, heavier, and built for function. Occasionally, the guards allowed leftover baked goods from the staff kitchen to be placed on the prisoner serving line. Elizabeth remembered one day in particular when a tray of muffins appeared. They were slightly sweet, and some had pieces of dried fruit inside. The women stared at them as if they were fragile. Elizabeth held hers carefully. It felt wrong to take something that looked expensive, something that felt like a treat. She ate it slowly, feeling each bite as a reminder that there were still normal moments in the world. During certain weeks, the prisoners received fresh fruit, 1 piece per person. Apples were the most common. They were firm, with crisp texture. In Germany near the end of the war, a single apple might have been shared among several people in a household. Here it was given without hesitation. The simple act of biting into fresh fruit without concern about rationing felt unreal to Elizabeth. She noticed she always ate the fruit last during meals, saving it as a reward. Over time, Elizabeth realized that the food affected more than hunger. It affected mood. People became calmer. Conversations during meals grew longer. Some women opened up about their families, their homes, and memories from before the war. Elizabeth listened to these stories while eating food that reminded her that the world still had normal places in it. The camp still controlled her movement, but the availability of food gave her back a sense of dignity. Over the weeks, Elizabeth began to notice patterns in how the American guards behaved. At first, she had expected them to be harsh, strict, or even cruel, based on everything she had heard about enemy soldiers. Instead, most of them were professional, polite, and consistent in their instructions. They spoke clearly, used gestures when words failed, and rarely raised their voices. Elizabeth noticed that their role was to supervise, not to intimidate or punish unnecessarily. It created a strange mix of tension and comfort. She was still a prisoner, but the guards were not actively trying to make her life miserable. Some guards showed small acts of fairness or thoughtfulness. If a prisoner dropped a tool or piece of equipment while working, a guard would hand it back without comment. If someone had trouble carrying a heavy load, the guard might nod and wait patiently until the prisoner caught up. These gestures seemed small, but for Elizabeth, they were meaningful. They showed her that the guards were not cruel by nature. They were performing a duty within rules and structure. She began to feel that the environment, though confined, was predictable and reliable. Communication was still a challenge. Elizabeth's English was limited, and only a few guards spoke German. Interpreters were available but not always present. Still, Elizabeth found that simple gestures, nods, and written notes could help. Over time, she learned which guards were patient and which were strict. She adjusted her behavior accordingly, following instructions promptly and showing effort in her work. She realized that respect could go both ways. By behaving responsibly, she received more freedom and trust. Sometimes guards interacted in casual ways. They asked simple questions about the prisoner's well-being or where they were from. Elizabeth noticed that these small exchanges made a difference in morale. Even though she could not speak freely about Germany or the war, acknowledging that someone cared about her safety or comfort gave her a sense of humanity. It was different from life during the final months in Germany, where fear and scarcity dominated interactions. Physical contact was limited and formal. Guards did not hit, push, or force prisoners unnecessarily. Discipline was administered according to strict rules. Elizabeth observed that violations of the camp's regulations were handled calmly and methodically. A warning was given first. If the warning was ignored, a small punishment might follow, such as extra work hours or temporary restriction from certain areas. Even these punishments were not violent or excessive. They were measured, and Elizabeth could predict the consequences if rules were broken. Over time, Elizabeth began to see the guards not as enemies, but as people performing a difficult job in a foreign country. She never forgot that they were armed and in control of her life. But she also saw that their responsibility required order and fairness. Their presence became part of the routine she had grown accustomed to. Another predictable element in her daily life. She felt that following instructions and showing respect allowed her to live with fewer conflicts and more personal space. Elizabeth also learned small lessons about trust. She could ask a guard for clarification if she did not understand a task. She could rely on them to provide equipment or maintain safety during work. Though the camp remained a prison, the guard's behavior allowed her to adapt to the environment without constant fear. Over time, she realized that human interactions, even under strict circumstances, could include fairness, patience, and reliability. By the end of her first month in the camp, Elizabeth felt a cautious respect for the guards. She understood her place as a prisoner, but she also understood that the men in uniform were not monsters. They were professionals, following rules, and in doing so they gave her and the other prisoners a structure that made life inside the camp manageable and predictable. After a few weeks in the camp, Elizabeth received her first opportunity to write a letter home. It was a small piece of paper, and the pens were simple, but the chance to communicate with her family filled her with hope and anxiety at the same time. She carefully wrote her name, date, and a few words about her health and daily life. She avoided mentioning anything political or about the war. She simply wanted to let her family know that she was alive. Holding the envelope in her hands, she felt both relief and fear. Would her letter reach Germany? Would her family even be able to read it? Receiving replies was even more complicated. Letters arrived weeks later, sometimes incomplete or delayed. When Elizabeth finally received a letter from her mother, she could barely believe it. Her handwriting on the page was messy and hurried, but the words were clear. Her family was alive, though tired and living in difficult conditions. Elizabeth clutched the letter, reading it again and again, finding comfort in every line. Even though she was far from home, those small notes reminded her that she had connections that survived the war. News from Germany traveled slowly through letters and occasional camp bulletins. Elizabeth learned about shortages, destroyed homes, and cities under bombing campaigns. It was difficult to read, but it helped her understand that her life in the camp, although restrictive, was safer than what many people at home were facing. Sometimes the news felt heavy, but she tried to balance it with memories of better times. She thought of her parents, her small hometown, and the streets she had walked before the war. The letters were a bridge between two worlds, one familiar and one entirely new. Writing letters also gave Elizabeth a sense of agency. Even if she could not influence the outcome of the war or the choices made by others, she could choose her words carefully, report on her health, and maintain a connection with home. These letters became part of her daily routine. She would sit at a small table in the barracks, organize her thoughts, and write slowly. The process required patience. She often revised sentences to make sure they were clear and would not worry her family unnecessarily. Sometimes other women in the camp would gather to exchange news about letters. They would share when letters had arrived, what they said, or what parts of home had changed. Elizabeth found some comfort in these conversations. Hearing others describe news from their families reminded her that she was not alone in her feelings of worry, relief, and hope. It created a quiet sense of community among the prisoners, something she had not expected when she first arrived. Through the weeks, the letters also helped Elizabeth maintain perspective. She understood that she was living in a controlled environment where safety, food, and shelter were predictable. Even though she longed for home, she could see that the camp offered protection from the chaos happening in Germany. Each letter she wrote or received reinforced this balance. The outside world was dangerous and uncertain, but inside the camp, she had stability. Eventually, Elizabeth learned to look forward to mail days. She could not predict what she would receive, but even small scraps of news, a few words from her parents, or a brief note from a friend gave her hope. The letters became more than communication. They were reminders of the life she would eventually return to, the world waiting beyond the fences, and the reason to endure the routine, the work, and the time in the camp. German prisoners of war held in the United States were part of a highly organized system designed to manage large numbers of captives far from the battlefields of Europe. Camps were constructed with clear rules, schedules, and designated work assignments. Prisoners were expected to wake, eat, work, and sleep according to strict routines. Although the camps were safe and the guards generally treated prisoners fairly, life was not easy. The work could be physically demanding, and prisoners had very limited freedom. Most men and women were assigned to labor in kitchens, laundry, workshops, or agricultural fields. These tasks were essential for the operation of the camp, and failure to complete assignments could lead to warnings or small punishments such as extra work hours or temporary restrictions. Food was more abundant than what prisoners had experienced during the war, but it was still rationed and served in strict portions. Meals were consistent and carefully planned to provide enough calories for daily work. Despite the relative abundance, prisoners had no control over what they ate or when, and they had to adjust to unfamiliar American foods. Living quarters were shared, often crowded, and privacy was minimal. The combination of labor, rules, and limited personal space made life monotonous and challenging, even when the basic needs of food and shelter were met. As the war in Europe ended in 1945, the situation for German POWs began to change. The United States prepared to repatriate prisoners, but the process took time because of the sheer number of captives and the complexity of transport logistics. Prisoners were organized into groups and placed on ships bound for Europe. Many camps continued to operate for weeks or months after Germany's surrender, maintaining routines and work assignments until departures were arranged. Once returned to Germany, prisoners faced a new set of challenges. Much of the country had been damaged by bombings, infrastructure was disrupted, and basic resources like food, housing, and medical care were scarce. Former prisoners often had to rebuild their lives from scratch. While the American camp system had kept them alive and generally safe, it could not prepare them for the social, economic, and emotional difficulties that awaited in post-war Germany. Overall, the American POW system achieved its primary goals. It kept prisoners secure, organized, and fed until they could be returned home. Life in the camps was regimented and demanding, with limited personal freedom, but it was far safer than the conditions in Europe during the last years of the war. The system required prisoners to adapt to strict routines, perform necessary labor, and accept a high level of oversight. By the time repatriation occurred, the prisoners had endured months of controlled, disciplined life far from their homes, and they returned to Germany physically safe but facing the immense challenge of rebuilding their lives in a war-torn country. The system of German prisoner of war camps in the United States left a lasting impact on both the prisoners and the country that hosted them. For the prisoners, the camps provided safety, reliable food, and medical care, which had often been scarce or unavailable in Europe. While life in the camps was strict and laborious, the experience introduced many prisoners to organization, order, and routines that were different from the chaos of war-torn Europe. The structure and consistency helped prisoners survive physically and, in some cases, emotionally, although adjustment back home after repatriation remained difficult. Many returned to Germany with new skills they had learned in the camp, such as farming techniques, cooking methods, or mechanical repair, which could be applied to rebuilding their communities. For the United States, the POW camps demonstrated the ability to manage thousands of enemy combatants effectively on domestic soil. The camps were carefully planned to balance security, labor needs, and humane treatment, reflecting adherence to international agreements such as the Geneva Convention. American officials learned how to organize logistics for food distribution, work assignments, and medical care on a large scale, experiences that influenced post-war military planning and administrative procedures. The camps also had economic effects. Prisoner labor supplemented labor shortages caused by the war, especially in agriculture and manufacturing, contributing to local communities and ensuring essential production continued. The legacy of the camps extended beyond practical outcomes. They showed that even in wartime, strict security and humane treatment could coexist. Stories from former prisoners highlighted moments of fairness, consistent routines, and acts of professionalism by guards, which contrasted sharply with the hardships and dangers they had experienced in Europe. For historians, the camps serve as a case study in balancing security, labor, and humanitarian obligations during conflict. Although the camps no longer exist, their impact persisted. Former prisoners often remembered the stability and predictability of life in the United States with a mix of relief and reflection. The experience demonstrated the capacity of organized systems to maintain order over large populations under unusual and difficult circumstances. The lessons learned influenced both military policy and international approaches to prisoner treatment in later conflicts. In the end, the American POW camps succeeded in their main objectives. They kept prisoners alive, safe, and productive until repatriation, while also demonstrating a functioning system of rules, labor, and supervision that balanced control with basic human dignity. The camps became a historical example of how a nation can manage large numbers of enemy combatants effectively while maintaining legal and ethical standards, and they remain a significant part of the story of World War II. As the war ended, German prisoners of war in the United States began the process of repatriation. This process took time because of the large number of prisoners and the logistical challenges of transporting them across the Atlantic. Ships had to be organized, and prisoners were grouped carefully to ensure safe travel. Even though Germany was no longer at war, returning home was not simple. Many prisoners faced destroyed cities, shortages of food and housing, and disrupted communities. The transition from structured camp life to the uncertainty of post-war Germany was difficult, and for some it required months to adjust physically and emotionally. Repatriation was not only a physical journey but also a social and psychological one. Prisoners had lived under strict routines, with predictable work, meals, and supervision. Returning to a country struggling to recover meant encountering chaos and scarcity instead of the controlled environment they had become used to. Despite these challenges, former POWs often carried lessons learned in the camps: patience, discipline, and practical skills. Many used these skills to contribute to rebuilding efforts, whether in agriculture, construction, or other trades. The American POW system also left a broader historical legacy. It became an example of how a nation could treat enemy prisoners according to international standards while maintaining security and using labor effectively. Stories from former prisoners showed that structured, humane treatment could reduce conflict, maintain morale, and even provide skills useful for life after the war. Scholars studying the camps note that while life was not easy, the experience was far safer than remaining in wartime Europe. Ultimately, the repatriation of German prisoners marked the end of an unusual chapter in both American and German history. The camps had managed thousands of prisoners, maintained order, and provided basic needs, yet they could not erase the long-term consequences of the war itself. For former prisoners, the journey home was both relief and challenge, a return to a homeland in need of reconstruction, where survival and adaptation continued long after the last camp gates had closed. Chicago, Illinois, July 11, 1952. Republican National Convention. The partnership between Eisenhower and Richard Nixon began on a hot summer day in Chicago. The Republican National Convention had just nominated Eisenhower as their candidate for president. Now he needed to choose a running mate. Eisenhower was a war hero. He had led Allied forces to victory in World War II. He was beloved by millions of Americans. When he ran for president in 1952, he seemed almost like a king, someone above regular politics, someone everyone could trust. Richard Nixon was different. He was young, ambitious, and hungry for power. He had made his name by going after communists in government. He was a fighter, a scrapper, someone who played political hardball. He was only 39 years old. Eisenhower barely knew Nixon. They had met only a handful of times, but Republican leaders pushed hard for Nixon. They said he could help win California. They said he could attract conservative voters. They said he could do the dirty political work while Eisenhower stayed above the fighting. So Eisenhower agreed. He chose Nixon as his running mate. But it wasn't a choice based on friendship or trust. It was a political calculation, and from that very first day, cracks began to show. When Eisenhower announced Nixon as his choice, his words were polite but cold. There was no enthusiasm, no warmth. People close to Eisenhower could tell he wasn't excited about this partnership. He was doing what he had to do. Nixon felt it too. He was thrilled to be chosen as vice president. This was his big break, his chance at the national stage. But he also sensed something was off. Eisenhower didn't treat him like a partner. He treated him like an employee. Over their 8 years together, Eisenhower would come close, very close, to throwing Nixon off the ticket. Not once, but twice. Most Americans had no idea this fight was happening. Eisenhower and Nixon kept it hidden. They had to. The Republican Party needed them to work together. But the truth was that Eisenhower never really wanted Nixon as his vice president, and he spent years trying to find a way to get rid of him. This is the story of their secret feud. It's a story about power, pride, and political survival. Just 2 months after the convention, the first real crisis hit their partnership. In September 1952, newspapers reported that Nixon had a secret fund. Rich supporters had been giving him money, about $18,000, to help with his political expenses. This was legal, but it looked bad. Really bad. The Democrats attacked. They said Nixon was corrupt. They said Nixon was being bought by rich businessmen. The newspapers jumped on the story. Suddenly, everyone was talking about the Nixon fund. Eisenhower was furious. This scandal could ruin his campaign. He had promised to run a clean government, to get rid of corruption. Now his own running mate was accused of taking secret money. Eisenhower considered dropping Nixon from the ticket. He told advisors that Nixon might have to go. He sent people to talk to Nixon about stepping down. But he wouldn't say it directly to Nixon's face. Nixon felt betrayed. He thought Eisenhower should defend him, should stand by him. Instead, Eisenhower was keeping his distance, waiting to see which way the wind blew. So Nixon made a desperate move. He went on television and gave a speech defending himself. It became known as the Checkers speech, because Nixon mentioned his family's dog, Checkers, which had been a gift. Nixon talked about his humble background. He talked about his wife's cloth coat, not a fancy fur coat. He said the only gift he would keep was Checkers, because his daughters loved that dog. It was emotional, it was personal, and it worked. Millions of Americans watched. They believed Nixon. They felt sorry for him. Letters and telegrams poured in supporting him. Eisenhower had no choice. He had to keep Nixon on the ticket, but he wasn't happy about it. He greeted Nixon afterward with words that were far from warm. He said, "You're my boy." It sounded friendly, but Nixon heard it differently. He heard a powerful man talking down to someone beneath him. From that moment on, Nixon knew the truth. Eisenhower didn't really want him. Eisenhower had almost thrown him away. And Nixon never forgot it. When Eisenhower and Nixon took office in January 1953, the problems between them didn't go away. In fact, they got worse. Eisenhower treated Nixon like a junior employee, not like a partner. He gave Nixon tasks, but they weren't important tasks. Nixon attended meetings, but Eisenhower often ignored his advice. Nixon was vice president in title, but he had very little real power. This was partly just how things were back then. Vice presidents didn't have much to do. The job was mostly ceremonial, cutting ribbons, attending funerals, giving speeches. But Nixon wanted more. He wanted to be involved in real decisions. He wanted to matter. Eisenhower, on the other hand, seemed happy to keep Nixon at a distance. He rarely invited Nixon to private meetings. He didn't ask for Nixon's opinion on major issues. When reporters asked Eisenhower about Nixon's role, he gave vague answers that made Nixon seem unimportant. Nixon did his best to stay relevant. He traveled around the country giving speeches. He met with Republican leaders. He worked hard to support Eisenhower's programs. He tried to prove his value, but Eisenhower still didn't warm up to him. In private conversations with friends, Eisenhower expressed doubts about Nixon. He said Nixon was too political, too ambitious, too hungry for power. He said Nixon would say anything to get ahead. Then came Eisenhower's health problems. In September 1955, Eisenhower had a heart attack. It was serious. For several days, doctors weren't sure if he would survive. Nixon suddenly found himself in a terrible position. If Eisenhower died, Nixon would become president. But Nixon knew that if he seemed too eager, too ready to take over, people would hate him for it. He had to walk a very careful line, be prepared to lead if necessary, but not look like he was hoping for Eisenhower to die. Nixon handled it well. He was respectful and careful. He didn't try to grab power. He visited Eisenhower in the hospital but didn't overstay. He kept the government running but didn't make any big decisions. Eisenhower recovered, but the heart attack made everyone think about the 1956 election. Would Eisenhower run again? He was 65 years old and had just had a heart attack. Maybe it was time to retire. And if Eisenhower retired, what would happen to Nixon? This question led to the biggest crisis in their relationship. Eisenhower decided to run for a second term. His doctors said he was healthy enough. His advisors said the country needed him. So in early 1956, he announced he would run again. But there was one big question. Would Nixon be on the ticket again? Behind the scenes, Eisenhower was actively trying to get rid of Nixon. He didn't want to fire him directly. That would look bad. Instead, he tried something sneakier. He tried to get Nixon to leave on his own. In December 1955, Eisenhower called Nixon into the Oval Office. He told Nixon that being vice president again might hurt Nixon's career. He suggested that Nixon should take a cabinet position instead, maybe Secretary of Defense or something similar. That way, Eisenhower said, Nixon could gain executive experience. He could build his resume for a future presidential run. Eisenhower called this charting your own course. He made it sound like he was doing Nixon a favor, but Nixon saw through it immediately. A cabinet position sounded important, but it was actually a demotion. Cabinet members served at the president's pleasure. They could be fired any time. Vice presidents couldn't be fired. Only voters could remove them. If Nixon left the vice presidency, Eisenhower could push him aside completely. Nixon was trapped. If he said no to Eisenhower's suggestion, he would look stubborn and power-hungry. If he said yes, he would lose his position as the likely next Republican nominee for president. So Nixon did something clever. He didn't say yes or no. He said he would serve wherever Eisenhower wanted him, but that the decision had to be Eisenhower's. If Eisenhower wanted to dump him, Eisenhower would have to do it openly. This put Eisenhower in a difficult spot. He didn't want to publicly fire Nixon. That would create a scandal and divide the Republican Party. But he also didn't want to enthusiastically endorse Nixon for another term. For months, Eisenhower tried to find a way out. He talked to Republican leaders about other possible vice presidents. He mentioned several other politicians who might be good choices. He kept hoping someone would come up with a solution that would get Nixon off the ticket without making Eisenhower look bad. There was even a dump Nixon movement among some Republicans. Harold Stassen, a former Minnesota governor who was working in Eisenhower's administration, publicly said the Republicans should replace Nixon with someone else. Stassen commissioned polls showing that other candidates might help the ticket more than Nixon. Nixon was humiliated. Here was someone in Eisenhower's own administration openly campaigning to get rid of him, and Eisenhower did nothing to stop it. For weeks, Eisenhower let Stassen continue his campaign against Nixon. Nixon fought back the only way he could. He met with Republican leaders around the country. He reminded them that he had worked hard for the party. He pointed out that dumping him would look terrible. It would suggest weakness and division. He made it clear that he wasn't going to quit voluntarily. The pressure built through the spring of 1956. Nixon felt like he was fighting for his political life. He knew that if he lost the vice presidency, his career might be over. Finally, Republican leaders told Eisenhower the truth. Dumping Nixon would be a disaster. It would anger conservative Republicans. It would make the party look divided. It would give the Democrats ammunition to attack. Reluctantly, Eisenhower gave in. In April 1956, he finally announced that Nixon would be his running mate again. But even then, he didn't sound enthusiastic. When asked directly if he wanted Nixon, Eisenhower gave a lukewarm answer. He said Nixon had been a good colleague and would continue in that role. Not exactly a ringing endorsement. Nixon had survived. He was still vice president, but he knew the truth now more than ever. Eisenhower had tried to get rid of him and failed. Their relationship was damaged beyond repair. The second Eisenhower-Nixon term, from 1957 to 1961, was marked by cold politeness. They worked together because they had to, but there was no warmth between them. Eisenhower continued to keep Nixon at arm's length. He gave Nixon some foreign trips and ceremonial duties, but Nixon was never part of Eisenhower's inner circle. The president's closest advisors were other people: his brother Milton, his chief of staff Sherman Adams, his cabinet members. Nixon was on the outside looking in. Nixon kept working hard, preparing for what everyone expected, that he would run for president in 1960. Eisenhower couldn't run again. The 22nd Amendment now limited presidents to 2 terms, so the Republican nomination would be open. Nixon was the obvious choice. As vice president for 8 years, he had experience and name recognition. Most Republicans assumed he would be their nominee, but Eisenhower wasn't enthusiastic about Nixon running. In private, he told friends he wished someone else would emerge as the Republican leader. He mentioned several other politicians he thought might make better presidents. He never mentioned Nixon that way. When 1960 arrived, Nixon did become the Republican nominee, just as expected, and Eisenhower, as the sitting Republican president, was expected to campaign for him, but Eisenhower's support was weak and inconsistent. He gave some speeches for Nixon, but not many. He didn't campaign aggressively. He seemed tired, old, ready to retire. Then came the moment that may have cost Nixon the election. In late August 1960, a reporter asked Eisenhower a simple question at a press conference. "Can you give us an example of a major idea of Nixon's that you adopted?" This was Eisenhower's chance to praise Nixon, to show that his vice president had been important and influential. Instead, Eisenhower snapped, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." He meant it as a joke. He was trying to end the press conference and seemed annoyed by the question. But the damage was done. "If you give me a week," those words, suggested that Nixon had contributed nothing important in 8 years as vice president. The Democrats immediately used it in campaign ads. They played Eisenhower's words over and over, showing that even his own president didn't think Nixon had accomplished anything. Nixon was devastated. He tried to explain that Eisenhower was joking, that it was taken out of context, but the damage couldn't be undone. The 1960 election was incredibly close. John F. Kennedy, the Democratic candidate, won by just over 100,000 votes out of nearly 69 million cast. It was one of the closest elections in American history. Could Eisenhower's comment have made the difference? We'll never know for sure, but many people, including Nixon himself, believed it hurt badly. If Eisenhower had been more supportive, more enthusiastic about Nixon, maybe those extra votes would have appeared. Instead, Eisenhower had dealt one final blow to Nixon's ambitions. After Nixon lost in 1960, the Eisenhower-Nixon relationship became even more distant. They saw each other occasionally at Republican events, but they weren't friends. They exchanged polite letters, but nothing more. Eisenhower retired to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He wrote his memoirs and played golf. He watched as Nixon tried to rebuild his political career, running for governor of California in 1962 and losing, then slowly working his way back. When Nixon finally won the presidency in 1968, Eisenhower was dying. He had suffered multiple heart attacks. Nixon visited him in the hospital, and they had one final conversation. We don't know exactly what they said to each other, but by then it probably didn't matter. Too much time had passed. Too much had happened. Eisenhower died in March 1969, just 2 months after Nixon became president. Nixon gave a speech at his funeral, praising Eisenhower as a great leader and calling him a friend. But those who knew the real story understood the irony. Looking back, the Eisenhower-Nixon feud tells us several important things about American politics. First, it shows that political partnerships are often just that, partnerships, not friendships. Eisenhower and Nixon worked together because it was useful, not because they liked each other. This is more common in politics than we might think. Second, it reveals how much happens behind the scenes that voters never see. For 8 years, Americans thought Eisenhower and Nixon were a team. They didn't know about the attempted dumps, the cold meetings, the lack of respect. The public image was very different from the private reality. Third, it demonstrates the power of persistence. Nixon refused to quit when Eisenhower tried to push him out. He fought for his position and survived. This stubborn determination would define his entire career, eventually leading him to the presidency and later to his downfall in Watergate. Finally, it shows how personal relationships can shape history. If Eisenhower had been more supportive in 1960, Nixon might have won that election. American history would have been completely different. No Kennedy presidency, no Johnson, possibly no Vietnam War as we know it. The secret feud between Eisenhower and Nixon reminds us that history is made by people, with all their flaws and conflicts. These weren't just names in history books. They were real men with real pride, real ambition, real dislike for each other. Eisenhower thought Nixon was too political, too slick, too willing to do anything to win. He was probably right. Nixon thought Eisenhower was a snob who looked down on him, who never gave him credit, who tried to destroy his career. He was probably right too. Nixon thought Eisenhower was a snob who looked down on him, who never gave him credit, who tried to destroy his career. He was probably right too. In the end, Nixon had the last word. He became president. He achieved the position that Eisenhower never thought he deserved. But the road there was much harder because of Eisenhower's opposition. And when Nixon finally reached the White House, the man who had tried to stop him was already gone. Their story reminds us that in politics, as in life, relationships matter. And sometimes the most important relationships are the ones that don't work, the partnerships that survive despite mutual dislike, the teams that function without trust, the alliances that hold together even when both sides want out. Eisenhower and Nixon managed to keep their feud mostly secret for 8 years, but the tension was always there, just below the surface, shaping decisions and affecting history in ways that most Americans never knew. Now, decades later, we can see the full story. And it's a reminder that what happens behind closed doors in Washington often matters just as much as what happens in public. Years after Eisenhower's death, Richard Nixon spoke and wrote about their relationship. What he said revealed a complicated mix of respect, resentment, and unresolved feelings. In his 1978 memoirs, Nixon was careful with his words. He praised Eisenhower as a great president and a military genius. He talked about the honor of serving under him. But if you read between the lines, you could feel the old wounds. Nixon admitted that Eisenhower had tried to dump him in 1956. He wrote about it matter-of-factly, as if it were just another political challenge he had overcome. But he also made sure readers knew how it had felt. The humiliation, the uncertainty, the sense of betrayal. He described the chart-your-own-course meeting in detail. He wanted people to understand what Eisenhower had really been trying to do, push him out without taking responsibility for it. Nixon clearly hadn't forgotten. When asked in interviews about the "give me a week" comment from 1960, Nixon's response was telling. He would say Eisenhower was just tired, that it was taken out of context, that it didn't really matter. But the fact that he kept bringing it up, kept explaining it, showed that it still bothered him decades later. Nixon also talked about Eisenhower's coldness. He described their relationship as professional but distant. He said Eisenhower treated him like a staff member, not like a partner. You could hear the hurt in his words, even after all those years. In private conversations with friends and advisors, Nixon was more honest. He said Eisenhower had never appreciated him, never given him credit for his work. He said Eisenhower was a snob who looked down on anyone who wasn't from the right background or the right social class. Nixon believed that Eisenhower's lack of support had cost him the 1960 election. He said it over and over in private. If Eisenhower had campaigned harder, if Eisenhower had shown more enthusiasm, Nixon thought he would have won. But there was also grudging respect. Nixon admired Eisenhower's leadership during World War II. He praised Eisenhower's ability to stay above political fights. He recognized that Eisenhower had been a popular and effective president. The most revealing moment came in 1990, when Nixon was asked what he had learned from Eisenhower. Nixon paused for a long time. Then he said that Eisenhower had taught him that popularity wasn't everything, that being liked wasn't the same as being respected. It was a strange answer. It suggested that Nixon had spent decades thinking about why Eisenhower had been so popular while he, Nixon, had never been loved by the American people in the same way. Nixon also reflected on their different approaches to politics. Eisenhower believed in staying above the fight, in being presidential and dignified. Nixon believed in getting into the trenches, in fighting hard, in doing whatever it took to win. Neither man really understood the other. Eisenhower saw Nixon's aggressive style as distasteful and beneath the dignity of high office. Nixon saw Eisenhower's detachment as privilege and condescension. Even in his final years, Nixon was still processing the relationship. He wrote notes to himself about Eisenhower. He talked about him in interviews. He seemed unable to let it go. Part of Nixon wanted to be Eisenhower, beloved, trusted, seen as above politics. But another part of Nixon resented Eisenhower for making it look so easy, for having the kind of natural popularity that Nixon could never achieve. In the end, Nixon's reflections on Eisenhower revealed more about Nixon than about Eisenhower. They showed a man who had spent his entire life feeling underestimated and underappreciated. A man who had fought his way to the top but never felt he got the respect he deserved. The feud with Eisenhower was just one chapter in that larger story, but it was an important chapter, one that shaped Nixon's view of himself and his place in history.